Sniper trap. The sniper intentionally shoots to wound instead of killing an enemy combatant, with the end goal of drawing more enemy units into the field of fire so the sniper can fire on them as they provide aid. Salvo. This technique's goal is to surprise the enemy and defeat him as quickly as possible to avoid his response. It's done by shooting the first shot with every cannon at the same time, and it's particularly good in water combat between ships because it also helps with setting the firing range since multiple splashes are more visible than a single one. It was mostly practiced during World War I and World War II since cruise missiles are now more commonly used. Hull down position. The tank would have to get on the backslope of a hill or use covers to expose as little of it as possible. This would make it possible for the barrel to be the only part visible to the enemy. It is still used in modern times, but it does have some cons. This technique is not fit for every terrain type, especially planes. The tanks have to have a great enough negative elevation, and they have to remain in the same position to not expose themselves. If the tank wants to go from defense to attack, it'd have a bad position as it would be looking upwards and exposing its underpart, which is usually the most vulnerable part. Creeping barrage. This technique consists in a gradual advance of artillery fire in order to provide cover for the infantry pushing forward towards the enemy trenches. It's better than using artillery directly on trenches, since most of the time they were resistant to it, defenders could easily be replaced, and barbed wires were left unharmed. However, it's pretty dangerous, as it needs coordination between infantry and artillery to avoid explosions too close to the infantry. Blitzkrieg. This technique was famously used by the Germans during World War II, and it consists of a rapid, overwhelming, and dense force concentration in an arrow shape, with mechanized and motorized infantry and armored at the top, with the intent of not attacking the actual front line, but breaking through it. They also used artillery and close air support. One of the biggest pros of this technique is that it unbalances the enemy by continuously changing front lines. Foxholes. It's a hole where two infantry are positioned to cover and stay when enemies are too near, thanks to camouflage applied to the opening. This technique is said to have been originally created to combat blitzkrieg. There were some variations of this. For example, Germans had turrets on them, and the Japanese were better concealed thanks to the limited space, which permitted only one infantry unit to get into it, making it more effective for ambushes than cover. Recon by fire. Firing on likely enemy positions to see if they react, with the goal of confirming their position or absence. Single envelopment. One decoy division attacks the front, while another one goes into the enemy's back from the sides and stops his reinforcements, communications, or shoots them from the back. Pincer movement. When the enemy does a frontal assault, the central units remain in the center, while the two wings move outside and go into the enemy's side, making him fight the battle on two fronts and eventually encircling him. Oblique order. This is another flank tactic, where one part of the army focuses on one side, while the other slowly moves in an oblique way to break through the enemy line thanks to force concentration. Feigned retreat. Pretending to retreat to draw in the enemy in a vulnerable position. It frequently turns into a real retreat because undisciplined troops are likely to lose coherence and retreat for real. Inverted wedge. The weak center retreats slowly under the pressure of the enemies, while the wings push forward to try to encircle the enemy. Great responsibility is placed on the wings here. Crossing the T. A line of warships crosses in front of a line of enemy ships. This makes every horizontal warship able to shoot the vertical ships with every gun, while the vertical ships can only attack with their front guns. Bounding overwatch. It's an alternating movement tactic that helps units go forward when they are under fire. This splits the team into two parts, one that provides overwatch and one that maneuvers. When the moving part of the team gets to its destination, they stop and start using suppressive fire to cover the other part, which starts moving and so on. Ambush. It's a surprise attack made by hidden units that wait for favorable positions or conditions to start attacking. Skirmishing. Skirmishers are troops placed in front of the main body of units that stay in a very spread out line and harass the enemy by engaging in small and sporadic combat to delay their movement, disrupt their attack, or weaken their morale. Trench raiding. Mainly used in World War I, it consisted of making small-scale nighttime surprise attacks on enemy trenches. They usually creeped up slowly on the sentries guarding a small sector of the trench line, killed them as quietly as possible, and threw grenades into the dugouts where the enemies would sleep. This was also used to capture or disable high-value equipment, gather intelligence by seizing documents, etc. The returning raiders risked friendly fire, so they usually had a password system to identify themselves. Swarming. This tactic is used to overwhelm a main target's defenses by attacking with multiple autonomous units. It's mainly used in asymmetric warfare, where one side has much less capacity or size, and it confuses the enemy thanks to irregular attacks, which usually happen from multiple positions. Flying wedge. It's a body of units that moves forward in a triangular formation. It was more commonly used in ancient times, when melee combat was the main focus, but it's still used now thanks to the great situational awareness and visibility it provides. It's also often used by police riot squads. Defeat in detail. It's most useful against a more numerous enemy, and it consists of dividing your force into smaller parts, which makes the enemy divide his forces as well, and then bringing a large portion of your force to fight against small enemy units in sequence, rather than in one large combat against the bulk of the enemy's divisions all at once. Air interdiction. Bombing strategic points, which don't pose an immediate threat but change the course of the war. A distinction must be made between tactical and strategic air interdiction. Tactical air interdiction is meant to affect events rapidly or immediately, for example, by bombing supplies en route to the active battle area. Strategic air interdiction focuses on longer-term benefits and usually targets bridges, streets, etc. This is different from strategic bombing, which is unrelated to ground operations. Siege. Surrounding an enemy city or fortress in order to block its supplies and escaping enemy troops with the goal of forcing them to surrender because of low supplies or attacking them with a well-prepared assault. When the soldiers build a line of fortifications around a besieged city, it's called a contravallation. When they build a second line of fortifications facing away from the enemy's fort to protect themselves from the fort's allies, it's called a circumvallation. Mouseholing. Open streets are very risky for infantry units since they sometimes don't provide sufficient cover, so they blast through walls to get into nearby rooms or buildings. Air assault. Using aircraft, such as helicopters, to get infantry behind the enemy lines and attack them from tank descent. It consists of infantry units sitting on top of a tank and dismounting to fight on foot only in the final phase of the assault. They don't just use the tank as a transportation method, they protect it against anti-tank weapons. Shoot and scoot. It's the artillery tactic of shooting at a target and immediately moving from the firing position to avoid counterattacks. Marching fire. It's a form of suppressive fire, where a group of walking infantry units keep firing to make the enemy hide behind cover, often with the final goal of getting closer to him and engaging in close combat. Center peel. It's a retreat technique used in modern-day infantry, often when small groups of infantry need to get away from a bigger enemy force. It's kind of similar to the bounding Overwatch technique. Defense in depth. This strategy seeks to delay rather than prevent the advance of an attacker, relying on the tendency of an attack to lose momentum over a period of time or as it covers a larger area. Once the attacker is forced to spread out to cover a larger area, the defenders can counterattack, having to fight against smaller separated units. Scorched earth. It involves retreating and destroying anything that the enemy might need, like food sources and transportation. It was famously used by Russia against Germany in the Second World War, supported by the size of Russian territory and the freezing